They came before Columbus, the African presence in ancient America, by Ivan van Sertima. Chapter 5. Among the Quetzalcoatls. Quote, the Quetzalcoatl of the Mexican Valley documents was never blonde or fair as stated by the friars, but virtually always pictured as black-bearded, and illustrations had his face painted black. End quote. Basil Hendrick, Man Across the Sea. Quote, yellow as the straw his beard is in flat contradictions to other descriptions of Quetzalcoatl that refer specifically to his black hair or black beard, from which several scholars have inferred that the nameless Aztec poet, employing poetic license, bleached the black beard of Quetzalcoatl to present him as a sun symbol. End quote. Constance Irwin, Fair Gods and Stone Faces. It was the sound of the drums that filled the shore with watchers. It came from far over the water like the playful thunder of gods on a calm, bright day. When they looked out to sea, at first they saw nothing. Then several dark forms appeared, boats drifting out of the east toward them like a shoal of sea dragons. The year was 1311. The strangest things had begun to happen. The diviners had said there would be another messenger coming from the lands of the sun god in that year. The vessel that bore him was the first to approach the shore. They saw him standing like a king under a canopy that had been mounted on a steeped dais in the center of the boat. He was clothed from head to foot in long, flowing white robes. He looked like a true child of the sun burned dark by its rays. His black hair and beard stood out against the whiteness of his vestment. Surrounding this white, bearded figure was a great company of boats. The men all looked marvelously black, as if they had been bathed in the sacred fire. Surely they had come from a land burning in the white heart of the sun. Against the blue canopy under which he stood, they could see quite clearly the outlines of a great golden bird, the serpent-slaying eagle. They thought that was an ensign of Quetzalcoatl. Truly, this was he come back again, as he had promised, by way of the sea where the sun rises, and with many white-capped, white-robed companions. It was exactly 6 cycles since he had disappeared from among the Toltecs at Tula. Thus must Abu Bakari II have appeared to natives in the American heartland when his fleet drifted into that world in 1311, as a white bearded figure coming from the east, the land of the sun, in boats. In like manner did Cortez appear exactly 4 cycles later, 1519, figuring in the imagination of the Mexican king Montezuma as another Quetzalcoatl, or messenger of the Sun King. Quetzalcoatl, as a solid figure of American history, the son of Mixcoatl, chieftain of the Toltecs, goes back to the 10th century, 980 to 999. As a mythical configuration, plumed serpent, rain god, etc., he goes back many centuries before that. Enormous confusion surrounds this complex figure. How could he have appeared and reappeared on the Atlantic seaboard, at times far separated, assuming different forms? How could he have been both native and foreigner, man and god, black and white? No one definition can embrace Quetzalcoatl. He had several representations or aspects. He was the feathered serpent king and rainmaker god in Central America. Quetzal, bird or plume, and caudal, serpent, signified a connection between bird and snake. The snake was supposed to be a kind of evil dragon guarding the well of life. He contained or imprisoned the life-giving moisture. An eternal conflict existed between him and the great bird who nested in the tree of life and would wrestle with and devour the snake, thus releasing the rains, the fertilizing waters necessary for men and crops. The origin of this serpent-devouring bird lies in Africa. The plumed serpent myth and all its highly arbitrary abstractions and interconnections, such as the winged disc motif, evolved through ancient Egypt's contact with black Africa and because of special political circumstances in the Egyptian dynastic period. Donald Mackenzie, in his book Myths of Pre-Columbian America, has shown how this happened. He has demonstrated what very real circumstances in Africa and Egypt led to the very abstract relationships between birds and serpents. The bird and serpent were incorporated at an early period into the mythology of the ancient Egyptians, but Africa provided the concrete stage for what was later to become a mythical combat between bird and serpent. There is only one bird in the world, Mackenzie points out, that is a persistent and successful hunter of serpents. This is the well-known secretary bird of Africa. In general appearance, writes a naturalist, it looks like a modified eagle mounted on stilts and may exceed 4 feet in height. It is heavy and powerful, with webbed feet and sharp talons. The naturalist, Verreau, gives the following description of the bird and of its method of attacking snakes. As nature exhibits foresight in all she does, she has given to each animal its means of preservation. Thus, the secretary bird has been modeled on a plan appropriate to its mode of life, and it is therefore for this purpose that, owing to the length of the legs and tarsi, its piercing eye is able to discover at a long distance the prey which, in anticipation of its appearance, is stretched on the sand or among the thick grass. The elegant and majestic form of the bird becomes even more graceful. It now brings into action all its cunning in order to surprise the snake, which it is going to attack. Therefore it approaches with the greatest caution. The elevation of the feathers of the neck and the back of the head shows when the moment for attack has arrived. It throws itself with such force on the reptile that very often the latter does not survive the first blow. To avoid being bitten, if the first attack is not successful, the bird uses its wings as a kind of shield, flapping them vigorously. Its powerful feet are the chief weapons of offense. No other bird has been so well equipped by nature for battling with snakes. Eagles and vulcans have powerful talons and beaks, but they do not possess the long legs of the secretary bird, which are absolutely necessary to ensure success when a serpent is attacked. Stories regarding this strange African bird were prevalent in ancient Egypt. The priests and seamen who visited Punt, in what is now Somaliland, became familiar with its habits. Mackenzie shows how the secretary bird of Africa suggested that form of the Egyptian myth of Horus, in which the god, as the falcon hawk, attacks the serpent form of Set, the slayer of Osiris. The Set serpent took refuge in a hole in the ground, and above this hole was set a pole surmounted by the falcon head of Horus. In the winged disc symbol of the sun god in ancient Egypt, we may trace the influence of stories about the secretary bird brought from Africa as the winged disc the god Horus pursues, Set and his companions in their various forms, including their serpent forms. This winged disc symbol is made up of the religious symbols of Lower and Upper Egypt, since these two divisions of ancient Egypt came to be joined through conquest. The winged disc became a political symbol of unity in the Nile Valley, representing the merger of the two parts. The disc represents the sun. The wings are those of the falcon god Horus, the chief deity of the dynastic Egyptians, who united Upper and Lower Egypt by conquest. The two serpents that entwine the disc and extend their bodies above the wings are the serpent goddesses of the two ancient divisions of Egypt, namely Nekhebit and Uazit, known by the Greeks as Buto. Occasionally, these serpents were crowned with the diadems of Upper and Lower Egypt. This bird and serpent motif in the winged disc symbol traveled in ancient times to America. We find not only clear evidence of the Egyptian prototype in the winged disc of ancient Mexico and Polynesia, but we find it used in the same way. The ancient Egyptians placed the image of the winged disc over the entrances to the inner chambers of a temple, as well as over its gates, and on stela and other objects. Sometimes the symbol was simply the winged disc without the serpents. In pre-Columbian America, the winged disc was placed on temple door lintels as in Egypt. The Polynesian form of the winged disc is of special interest because it shows in the disc the head of the bird devouring the serpent, the secretary bird of Africa with which seafarers had become familiar. Professor Elliott Smith has shown how Egyptians influenced symbolic gateways in Asia. The winged disc of Egypt on the gates represent the means of communication between the living and the dead, and symbolically the portal by which the dead acquired a rebirth into a new form of existence. The megalithic gateway of the sun at Tiahuanaco in South America is one of several American gateways distinguished by the Egyptian winged disc symbol. It not only carries this symbol over the gate, but a frieze depicting 3 rows of birdmen attendants. The origin of birdmen and of gods with bird heads in Black Africa and their later diffusion to dynastic Egypt will be discussed when we come to deal with Negro African influence on ancient Egypt and the Negro and Egyptian influence on the Olmec heartland. But now let us return from the ancient symbols of Quetzalcoatl to Quetzalcoatl as man in the medieval Mexican world. The name was given to the native son of an American king, Mixcoatl, as well as to a number of extraordinary figures or cultural innovators from outside, at least one of whom appeared on the eastern Atlantic seaboard with a fleet of boats, and, after an indeterminate stay, set out again on the Atlantic with the intention of returning home. Quetzalcoatl was also the name given as a honorific title to 2 high priests of Tenochtitlan in Mexico, in memory of the god of civilization and learning, archetype of the priestly ideal. Tenochtitlan was found by the Aztecs in 1325, and the decision to found a city in that place was based upon a legendary battle between an eagle and a serpent there. The confusion between the native Mexican, son of Mixcoatl, and the alien figure appearing on the eastern seaboard has presented historical problems, but certain facts are now clear. The Quetzalcoatl who came from outside and was reputed to have landed in America in a company of boats was a tall, bearded man. He was clad in long white garments, probably carried a royal mace or ball of some kind in his hands, and wore a turban, conical crown, or similar headdress. The main source of confusion over his appearance has been the use of the word white in some oral traditions. The word has been completely misinterpreted by many scholars and has led to the most fanciful notions that it was a European who innovated civilization and religious reform in America. The myth and ritual, the pattern of religious expression in America, differ sharply from those of Europe. The Catholic friars finding the cross in America, the cross is also found in pre-Christian Africa and had nothing to do there with Christ, pounced on the phrase white bearded figure and claimed that Quetzalcoatl was Saint Thomas or Saint Brendan. In 1949, P.M. Hansen even made claims for Quetzalcoatl as a reincarnated Jesus Christ. As Basil Hedrick points out, quote, "The Quetzalcoatl of the Mexican Valley documents was never blonde or fair, as stated by the friars, but virtually always pictured as black-bearded and in illustrations had his face painted black." End quote. The truth is, white is a purely European convention when used as an exclusive referent for skin color and race. White in American Indian terms did not mean, in pre-Columbian times, Caucasian. Quetzalcoatl did not have Northern European features. Native Americans spoke of him at times as being white in a symbolic sense, in the way Muslims may speak of Muhammad as a handful of white light in Allah's palm. A black or brown Negroid Hamitic man, as Abu Bakr was, appearing out of the east in long flowing white Muslim robes, would be called white. White may also be used as a referent to skin for pale Asiatics like the Japanese. Menkat Ape relates in a narrative published in 1725 that when a band of white-bearded figures haunting the Pacific coast in a post-Columbian period were hunted down, they were found to be Japanese. Even in this instance, the term white, used as a literal referent for the skin of the Japanese, was a post-Columbian linguistic influence. Mackenzie has discussed all the tales of white-bearded men who are alleged to have appeared in America. He presents a number of Quetzalcoatl representations that are indisputably based on an Asiatic figure. A Quetzalcoatl from the west, the Pacific, does not cancel out a Quetzalcoatl from the east, the Atlantic. The Asiatic Quetzalcoatl is found in the world of the Aes, the black Quetzalcoatl in Mexico, and the Yucatan. Thor Heyerdahl, however, has argued strongly for the pre-Columbian appearance of a Caucasoid figure to explain the so-called white god of civilization with which Quetzalcoatl is sometimes identified. His arguments are ingenious, but when he presents sculptures of the white Quetzalcoatl, they all speak very clearly against his case. They are all native or Asiatic, or black-faced or non-human. None is European in facial contour. This is not to deny that there may have been a few Europeans in America before Columbus. There is a real case, for example, for the pre-Columbian presence of the Vikings in the northernmost part of the American continent, circa AD 1000. The most brutally critical appraisal of the literature on this subject, a vast library, by Brigitta Wallace concedes incontrovertible archaeological proof in the Norse site L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, even though the Newport Tower may be questionable and the Vinland map a fake. What, however, is the significance of this early contact in the cultural history of the American? The Vikings brought no new plant, influenced no art, introduced no ritual, left no identifiable trace of their blood in the Native American. Like waves, they broke for a moment on alien sands and then receded. The same may not be said of the African. He is not enshrined, perhaps, in an architectural monument, but his face broods over the Olmecs. His skeleton lies beside the ancient Mexican magicians. A strain of his cultivated cotton is found married to an American wild ancestor. His blood runs even in the veins of the Lacanadons, the most secluded of the Maya tribes. It is one thing, therefore, to concede a European pre-Columbian presence. It is another thing to claim that Europeans, be they northern Vikings or southern Viracochas, brought civilization to the Americans before Columbus. This flies in the face of all the known cultural facts. The myths, the rituals, the magical religious systems of Native America stand out in sharp contrast to those found anywhere in Europe. What is more, the agricultural system and the calendar. A white Quetzalcoatl is alleged to have introduced elements of both, bear no relationship to ancient or medieval crop science and timekeeping among European peoples. There is a disturbing and persistent attempt, and it may be quite unconscious, so involuntary has become the racial reflex, to create a white superhuman to account for all civilization and major achievements of non-Caucasoid peoples. In this connection, I would like to take issue with Eric von Daniken, who, in his Chariot of the Gods, invents a divine species from outer space to account for the building of both the Egyptian pyramids and the gigantic stone figures of Easter Island. Quetzalcoatl, in some of his representation, does wear solar ear disc, but this is because of his association with the sun god complex. Von Daniken finds representations of birdmen in Egypt and America, but these have nothing to do with outer space. The first birdmen appear in the rock art of Africans in the Tassili Mountains of the Sahara, centuries before they appear in the tomb art of dynastic Egypt and in the art of ancient America. It is true, of course, that the huge figures of Easter Island represent no known human race, but are a race of legendary giants. The prototype of the superhuman giant, however, may be found on this earth and within the same sun god complex. The Egyptian god Horus attained, according to J.H. Breasted, a stature of 8 cubits, nearly 14 feet. Camels have been found etched on the rocks of the desert plateau of Marcahuasi in South America. Because there were no camels in South America, von Daniken assumes spacemen etched them there. A Native American camel existed in prehistoric times, as finds in Egyptian cave Nevada show. But even if this were not the prehistoric camel, is it not more logical to assume that Africans who were very familiar with the camel drew these animals? Is it harder to believe in Africans crossing the Atlantic a distance of 1,500 miles, than an artist from outer space etching camels in Marka Hawasi, 15 light years away from their home star? Hedrick, who has done the most recent research on the subject of Quetzalcoatl, has tried to link the appearance of the native Quetzalcoatl in the north with the latter appearance of Kukulkan, the feathered serpent figure in the south. He gives a late 10th century date, AD 999, for the disappearance of Quetzalcoatl from the Toltec capital of Tula, and a date of circa 1020 for his appearance as Kukulkan in the Yucatan. Hedrick believes the man Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkan were one and the same, and dismisses any consideration of him as an alien from another hemisphere. He believes he was an indigenous Mexican, being dark-skinned as opposed to a fair European outsider. He succeeds in effectively dismissing the myth of a white pre-Columbian visitor as the origin of Quetzalcoatl. But in his attempt to do this, he limits the issue to a simple either-or proposition. Thus, his article on Quetzalcoatl was entitled Quetzalcoatl, European or Indigene. The possibility of Quetzalcoatl being a dark-skinned outsider, such as an African or Arab African, which will fit in with the relevant descriptions and cultural data, does not enter into his considerations at all. The 10th century dates that Hedrick gives fit in well with his thesis. I would not contest a native Quetzalcoatl. Mixcoatl's son came to be known as Quetzalcoatl simply because he was the high priest of that god. But while Quetzalcoatl's first appearance as a man may be traced to a native figure, Quetzalcoatl grew into a complex myth and emerged as a god of cultural innovation and civilization because of a series of reappearances, actual and expected, in American history. As the Jews waited for the appearance of a Messiah, so did the Americans wait the cyclical return of the legendary Quetzalcoatl. Such an expectation led them to assume that Cortez was a Quetzalcoatl when he appeared in Mexico in 1519, precisely 4 cycles after the appearance of Abu Bakr II in 1311. A cycle is 52 years by American Indian time. Abu Bakr II himself, as I mentioned earlier, appeared exactly 6 cycles after the disappearance of Quetzalcoatl by way of the sea from among the Toltecs, AD 999. How developed was the Quetzalcoatl cult and its rituals when the Mandingo came? This is hard to say, but it must have taken on a broad general pattern to which details from outside were later added. We can be certain it did have some embryonic form before the coming of the Mandingo. The pyramid of Cholula, dedicated to Quetzalcoatl, predates the Mandingo journeys by many centuries. The plumed serpent motif in ancient Mexico goes back to a much earlier contact. We can be equally certain that the feathered serpent cult in medieval Mali fused with that in medieval Mexico. The ritual correspondences between the two cults are so close that they pass beyond the stage of mere cultural convergence to the point where, quote, the incidents of coincidence, unquote, clearly suggest a medieval marriage and fusion. The Mexican Quetzalcoatl was the fine feathered snake. He was also the symbol of water or moisture produced by rain, which after a long drought awakens vegetation to a new life. The high priest also spoke of Kukulkan, his counterpart in South America, as the feather snake which goes into the water. And these figures in both cases became identified with the rain god. The rain ceremonial dedicated to the rain god, is represented by the image of Quetzalcoatl, and to him is ascribed the invention and conscientious execution of penance and chastisements. In the figure of Quetzalcoatl, the rain god was combined with the rain magician who, with his prayer and his practices, ensured to his people the rain needed for their crops. From this, Quetzalcoatl evolved as a god from whom prosperity could rain. In medieval Mali, the equivalent of Quetzalcoatl is the Dasiri of the Bambara, the tribe of the Mandingo from which Abu Bakari came. The Dasiri is the protector of the village, the beneficent spirit whose sacred animal is a snake, who is addressed with the words, "Preserve us from evildoers. Above all, give us rain, without which the harvest is impossible." The feast of the Dasiri takes place at the beginning of the year, like that of Quetzalcoatl. The worship of the Dasiri is closely associated with the activity of the Mandingo Kuare. This Kuare, or Kore, is a semi-secret sect whose initiates perform certain dances and sacrifices under a tree where the spirit is supposed to live. The most striking of these are the self-flagellating dances, dances of penance and chastisement, in which the dancers wrap themselves in thorns or lacerate their breasts and armpits. Some beat themselves with long, flexible scourges. In the Quetzalcoatl ceremonial, the same self-chastisement and the use of thorn pricking occurs. In both the Mexican Quetzalcoatl and the Mandingo Dasiri worship, these thorn prickings and whippings were designed to bring blood out in drops. This blood dropping or bloodletting symbolized the falling of raindrops. Again, Quetzalcoatl is later represented with a beard, so alien to the Native American chin. In Dasiri worship, the house chiefs are all old men, and the religious priest who presides over them is bearded. In the Mexican ritual, the presiding priest of the Quetzalcoatl cult adopted an artificial beard. The artificial beard, as such, was an earlier influence. As the Dasiri and Kore festivals take place annually, the god or spirit becomes the measurer of time. Similarly, Quetzalcoatl is considered to be the inventor of the calendar, some aspects of which have been shown to correspond closely to an Egyptian calendar introduced as late as 747 BC. There is also an ancient calendar found in Chiapas, described by Bishop Francisco Núñez Vega, that mentions 7, quote, negritos, unquote, representing the 7 planets, and in detail refers to the naming of their 20-day calendar. Quetzalcoatl is associated with a tree. The Dasiri and Kore are inseparable from a tree. The Dasiri is supposed to live on a specific tree which is sacred. In like manner, Quetzalcoatl is represented as a hummingbird kneeling on the top of a tree. The Dasiri is also worshipped on an altar of a conical or truncated form, which supports a clay bowl. The bowl, which receives libations, is placed under a tree or on the first branches of the tree. This same tree is represented in America. D.G. Brinton, in his Primer of Mayan Hieroglyphics, describes this tree, a central design in the Chilean Belam, or Sacred Book, of Mani. This work reveals the Mayan design of the cosmos, known as the tableau of the Bacabs, or the plate of the Bacabs, an exact representation of the Bambara altar and of the bowl on the lower branches of the tree, with a celestial vase catching the rain from the cloud mass. This design, according to Brinton, is surrounded by 13 heads, which signify the 13 Ahu Khatuns, or greater cycles of years. The number 13 in American mythology symbolizes the 13 possible directions of space. The order of 13 heads expresses the totality of space and time, and the design itself symbolizes life within space and time. This is shown as follows. At the bottom of the field lies a cubical block, which represents the earth, always conceived of in this shape in Mayan mythology. Above the earth cube, altar of the gods, supported by 4 legs, which rest upon the 4 quarters of the mundane plane, is the celestial vase, which contains the heavenly waters, the rains and the showers. Above it hang the heavy rain clouds ready to fill it. Within it grows the tree of life, spreading its branches far upward. On the extremities, the flowers or fruit of life, the soul or immortal principle of man. Apart from the central design in the plate of the Bachabs, within which are the altar, bowl, cloud mass, tree, and god, corresponding to the Mandingo altar, bowl, cloud mass, tree, and god of the Dasiri, there are other designs that are also remarkably similar to those found in Mandingo territory. Thus, the 13 heads in the plate represent the division of the zodiac into 13 parts, and this zodiacal division into 13 has been found in 13-headed zodiacal designs on calabashes in West Africa. It is a curious fact that a similar division into 13 is recorded only among West Africans and Americans, with the sole exception of a little-known people, the Kirgizis. Secret signs and glyphs are inscribed within geometric designs on the plate of the Bachabs. Leo Wiener has presented evidence to show that these signs and glyphs correspond closely to and may have their origin in Arabic or Sudanic gadwals. Gadwal is a technical term in sorcery. It is a talisman or charm and consists of a sign or inscription written or drawn on a piece of paper within quadrangular or polygonal designs, squares, parallelograms, or even circles. These signs or inscriptions are supposed to possess magical powers. They usually consist of letters or numerals, magic words, the names of gods, the angels and demons, as well as the planets, the days of the week, and the elements, and sometimes even pieces from the Quran, like the Fatiha, the first chapter. The applications of these magical designs are manifold. Frequently, the paper on which one is drawn is burned to smoke someone with its smoke, or the writing is washed off and drunk. The underlying notion between the gadwals is that secret relationships exist between the various components of the gadwal, and positive results may be achieved by the most propitious arrangement of these components. These talismanic signs, written or drawn in columns, which have their origin in the Arab world and are found in the West African Sudan, show a strong resemblance to Central American glyphs. The most interesting of the Sudanic rock inscriptions, photographed by Desplognus, have columns of glyphs, most of which begin with the form of spiders. The design of these spiders makes them identical to the ones on American burial mounds given by Holmes in Art and Shell of the Ancient Americans. The amazing thing about these spiders, both the African and the American, is that they carry a cross in their centers. This is not the Christian type of cross, but is the simplest representation of the fourfold division of the guidewire. It is an ornamentation that is in constant use in the Western Sudan. It forms the central design of circular objects and is done in square patterns and looped ends, exactly as in the bird guidewires found in pre-Columbian American mound builder gorgets, burial mounds, and is worked in dotted line forms upon knobs. In the mound builder gorgets are found not only the spider with its gadwells, but the looped end gadwell with a cross in the center, all placed within a circle. These are among the most striking of the objects in the mounds. Another notable correspondence between the cultures of Mexico and Mali may be found in the priestly cap of the Magi. This is a conical hat with a neck flap, which was a distinctive headgear of kings and priests in ancient Persia. It was passed on from Persia to the Arabs and perpetuated among the magicians of West Africa. It reappears in America as a crown worn by the black-bearded Quetzalcoatl. Its shape is not its only distinctive feature. It was the representation of the visible heaven, and so was painted to represent stars. Leo Wiener has traced the Arabic name for this starred hat through the Mande language, and the same name for the hat is found in Mexico. Arabic Kubila, Mande Kofila. In Mexico, Copilai. All are pronounced roughly the same word, in fact, following the phonological rules of transformation in its passage through the three language areas. Standing by itself, this could be a simple coincidence. The details of the cap, however, seem conclusive. Clavigeiro, in the History of Mexico, describes the hat. The crown, he says, which was called by the Mexicans Copilai, was a sort of small mitre, the fourth part of which was raised up and terminated in a point, and the part behind was lowered down and hung over the neck. And the Copilai, says E. Seller in the Codex Borgia, was a headdress frequently made of an ocelot skin, so as to represent a lot of dots, that is, the stars of the magician's cap. That this kingly and priestly cap of the Magi, with its conical shape and star decoration, should have been preserved in America in its identical form, and should also have kept almost the same name which was current for it among the Mandingo, strongly suggests that the cap represented the influence of the 14th century African visitors. Quetzalcoatl ritual was largely rain-making ritual. Controlling the weather and ensuring an adequate fall of rain were among the primary tasks of the cult's priests and magicians. The rainmaker was thus an important person in both African and American cultures. There are instances of rainmakers entering foreign provinces during a time of drought and acquiring instant control over a people because they brought rain. The first Mandingo king to become a Muslim convert was persuaded to enter the new faith by a Mohammedan whose prayers in a time of great drought coincided with the fall of rain. The Mohammedan, of course, was no rainmaker in the classical sense, But luckily he entered the king's court at a most propitious moment for his propaganda mission. Often a special class of magicians existed in African societies for the sole purpose of regulating the heavenly water supply. In some African societies, the rainmaker was known as the Shepherd of Heaven and held the office of both political and providential king. The Mandingo kings, in spite of their later Muslim orientation, never lost their ritual link with the land and the weather. They were princes of the magicians, animists first, Muslims a poor second, as the Epic of Sundiata, the founder of the Mali Empire, clearly shows. They always kept their royal capital in the agricultural provinces, close to the cultivators who preserved this mystical connection between the king and the crops. A number of general features in rainmaking ritual may be highlighted in a comparative outline of weather magic in African and American cultures. The discovery of the skeletons of ancient magicians of Mexico with strong Negroid characteristics, as reported by Frederick Peterson, suggests that here was a fertile area of influence. The black figure predominates in American magic, and while it was convenient to think this blackness was exclusively symbolic when one believed there was no contact between the cultures on opposite sides of the Atlantic basin, we are now left to ponder the nature and extent of that influence, some of which could have been as early as the African and Egyptian presence in the Olmec heartland, 800 to 700 BC, some as late as the Mandingo contact period, 1310 to 1311. During the critical years of the founding of modern Mexico, the evidence seems to suggest that these black magicians brought a number of new ideas. This would account for vague basic parallels between the two systems, parallels which may have proceeded without contact from a common idea, developing through contact into a complex of identical traits. Rainmaking ritual in both Central America and West Africa, for example, included dancing with water-filled perforated pipes in the mouth and blowing the water through the perforation at the sky, throwing water from a vessel held high in the air so that the falling spray descended on the drought-stricken land or the suppliant crowd, squirting water in a fine stream from the mouth onto a field, and watering the graves of twins who were thought in both cultures to have some mysterious connection with the weather. The rainmakers in both culture areas made use of black rainstones, and in their sacrifices slaughtered black animals. This was also the case in South America, which the Africans visited either before or after filtering through into Mexico. A Peruvian oral tradition tells of black men coming to them across the Andes. To procure rain, the Peruvian Indians sacrificed black sheep in a field. The Africans of West Africa sacrificed black sheep, black fowl, the blood of black oxen and black cattle. Lest it be thought that these are natural choices suggested simply by the color of rain clouds, it should be pointed out that the Chinese did the opposite. To ensure a good harvest of their 5 cereals, they offered to the gods white wild boars, white oxen, and white sheep in a sacrifice. It is a curious fact that before Columbus set out on his 3rd voyage to pursue the Guinea route, as Don Juan had outlined it to him, he sent some of his men into Santiago, one of the Cape Verde Islands off Africa, to look for a herd of black cattle. The ritual value of these animals must have been high, and one may surmise that Columbus contemplated them as a gift to the American Indians. The search, however, which lasted several days, was not successful. Black clothes also were chosen by the West African and Mexican rainmakers for their ceremonials. Rain was stopped in both cultures by the use of fire sticks and firestones, sometimes by placing hot coals on the ground to burn the stubborn footfall of the rain. Many other analogies of a general nature may be noted, but let us confine ourselves to one on the same level of specificity as the rain-making rituals: the creation of effigies or magical images, often of enemies, in the belief that to injure or destroy the image is to effect a like injury or destruction upon the enemy himself. For thousands of years this was known to the sorcerers of Egypt, and was widely practiced in Africa. The North American Indians employed the same ritual of pricking or piercing the doll. For example, when an Ojibwe Indian desired to work evil on anyone, he made a little wooden image of his enemy and ran a needle into his head and heart, or he shot an arrow into it, believing that wherever the needle pierced or the arrow struck the image, his foe would at the same instant be seized with a sharp pain in the corresponding part of his body. If he intended to kill the person outright, he burned or buried the image, uttering certain magic words as he did so. The use of a person's private cast-offs, such as hair, nails, a rag of his garment, or drops of his blood, for magic directed against him, was also an African and American practice. The magician kneaded these relics into a lump of wax, which he molded and dressed in the likeness of the intended victim, who was then at the mercy of his tormentor. The idea was that if the image was exposed to fire, the person whom it represented would immediately fall into a burning fever. If it was stabbed with a knife, the victim would feel the pain of the wound. These practices are of great antiquity in Africa. An Egyptian wizard was prosecuted in 1200 BC for making effigies of men and women in wax, thereby causing paralysis of their limbs and other grievous bodily harm. Remarkable as these coincidences in image magic may seem, they could not be advanced as evidence suggestive of contact if other hard evidence was not available. Such evidence, however, exists, and it is in the light of this that these rituals should be re-examined, partly when it can be shown that the analogies in African and American magic go beyond single trait resemblances to major clusters or complexes of traits. End of chapter 5.